Ousting Nicolás Maduro, the opposition in Venezuela is intent on removing the president as the economic crisis bites everyone. But is the opposition a credible alternative to socialist rule? And how is the unrest in Venezuela being viewed regionally? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Darine Abugaida. Venezuela is unraveling as shortages of almost everything push people to their limits. 87% of Venezuelans say they don't have money to buy enough food. Many are forced to make do with a single meal a day. And riots and mass lootings are on the rise. Calls for President Nicolás Maduro to resign are growing louder, and the opposition has begun checking signatures on a petition to start a recall referendum against him. Lots for us to discuss. First, Virginia Lopez sets things up from Caracas.
None of Dulce Brito's children have had any breakfast today, and last night dinner was rice. She says she's tired of queuing for hours to buy food. Even then, she comes home empty-handed.
I have 6 children and I can't find anything for them. I have a daughter who is ill and I can't even find her medicine.
And this is why Dulce will make the difficult journey to have her signature checked on a petition calling for a referendum to remove President Nicolás Maduro from power.
The opposition has claimed that the Electoral Council is stalling the recall referendum in every step. One of their allegations is that densely populated communities such as this one were allocated one center with 2 machines, and small rural communities were instead given 5 machines.
The opposition has 5 days to validate close to 200,000 signatures, or 1% of the electorate. Failing to collect this 1% of the electorate of every state would kill off the referendum. Voters in this center in the Sucre municipality have waited for 3 hours. As their wait draws to a close, they say they're more determined than ever.
I'd wait until tomorrow if necessary because the situation in the country has become unbearable. But this is our only hope for change.
Social and political tensions are both rising in Venezuela. The government might not be able to block the referendum, but they could delay it. If it happens before January 10 of next year, there will be elections. If it doesn't, Maduro's vice president will be sworn in. For opposition leader and the man spearheading this process, a lack of political will is the only reason this could happen.
There's no legal or technical reason why the recall referendum can't take place this year. When Chavez wanted a recall referendum, it happened in 4 months. When he pushed for an amendment, it happened in 2 months. We've even had snap elections in 30 days, so there's no reason other than their whim for it to not be this year.
After a long journey and a 4-hour wait, Dulce is just a step away from validating her signature. But she says she's patient. She's had to wait a lot longer for food. Virginia Lopez, Al Jazeera, Caracas.
So, as we heard from Virginia there, the opposition needs to validate 200,000 signatures, or 1% of the electorate, to kickstart the process to recall President Maduro. After that, 20% of voters, or around 4 million Venezuelans, will need to sign a second petition to trigger the referendum. And for it to be successful, then an equal or greater number of voters than those who elected the president will need to vote in favor of a recall. And that means more than 7.5 million votes Maduro won in 2013. Time to bring in our guests for this discussion. In Caracas, we have Daniel Fermin. He's the researcher for the Center of Political Studies at the Andreas Bello Catholic University. In New York, Vanessa Neumann. She's the founder and CEO of trade integrity consultancy firm Asymmetrica. In Washington, D.C., Michael McCarthy, research fellow at the American University Center for Latin American Studies. Welcome to you all. Daniel, so we know that the timing of this referendum is really key, as Virginia was stating in her report. Will the opposition get what they want eventually?
Well, I think the characterization of the way you profiled the referendum process has been very accurate. What we're seeing in Venezuela right now is the institutions which are controlled by the Chavista regime closing ranks with the government as to stall the referendum, the recall process. They had the technical capacity to make the referendum happen this year, but they are, without a shadow of a doubt, stalling the process in order to delay it and to, I don't think they'll be able to stop it outright, but they will try to make it happen after January 10th, 2017, as to even if, as all polls are showing, even if President Maduro loses the recall referendum, to keep Chavismo in power. And I'd like to point out a formula, which is, well, it gives us a sense of the framework Chavismo is working with, the formula that former National Assembly President Diosdado Cabello, which is maybe number 2 in government ranks, has proposed. He said, let's make the referendum happen after January 2017, and whoever is vice president would assume the presidency, appoint Mr. Maduro as his vice president or her vice president, resign, and that way Mr. Maduro will be back in power. So it's obviously that makes a mockery out of the recall referendum mechanism and out of the democratic and constitutional principles. But that is very much the framework Chavismo is working with.
Vanessa,
right
you're nodding your head as Daniel is speaking.
It all comes down to keeping power.
Right. Vanessa, you're nodding your head as Daniel is speaking. Is this referendum a mockery? If so, how much of it is a mockery? And can the opposition overcome the number of hurdles that are put before them?
Yes, they are making a mockery out of the referendum. There's a number of different scenarios of how this will end, and all of them are bad, basically. But it's very, very important that the opposition stick to insisting on the referendum, because it is in the constitution that is written by the Chavistas. Their stalling, as Daniel Fermin was just pointing out, is incredibly obvious to absolutely everyone in the world. So it becomes basically the rallying point for the international community to support democracy in Venezuela and to support the efforts of the opposition to restore democracy. The more Chavismo stalls, the worse it is for them. I'm not sure what they think they're going to achieve by trying to stay in power until 2019. You already have sort of Somalia-like scenes where people are raiding food convoys, and food convoys have to be under military guard. Dogs and cats on the street are being eaten, and food, trash on the street is being eaten by the people. This is in a country that was, quite frankly, the Qatar of the 1970s and 1980s in the region. I mean, the fall from grace and from economic power has been stunning.
We'll talk about the details of what exactly is happening and what got Venezuela to this point in a moment. But Vanessa, just let me ask you this, because you were mentioning the international community, but how much political will at this point is there from the international community, and specifically from the Organization of American States, who we know are meeting on Thursday to discuss what's going on in Venezuela? But will they actually be taking any sort of punitive measures?
Well, it's not really in their charter that they can really take punitive measures. The punitive measures, basically what would happen is at the meeting of the 23rd, they would vote on whether the process in Venezuela is democratic or not, whether democracy has dropped off in Venezuela.
But the thing is, back in May, what they did is that in a report that they published, Vanessa, they said that there have been, and I'm quoting here, serious disruptions of the democratic order in Venezuela.
Right. So now they need to actually resolve that that's the case, and then send down people to have discussions and to facilitate discussions. If that doesn't work, then they get suspended by a 2/3 vote. It's quite a bit. It's a long diplomatic process, but they can accelerate it. Now there is a lot of pressure for this to happen, because the reason is not so much what can the OAS do, but it would be a tremendous moral victory for the opposition if the Venezuelan government is declared undemocratic by its own democratic charter of its own Western Hemisphere organizations. So it's not coming out of the European Union, and it's not coming out of the United States, which is really important. That would be a big moral victory. Here's the scenario that might be unleashed if the OAS declares it Venezuela undemocratic, both in the June 23rd, and then if it even suspends it by a 2/3 majority at a later meeting, is that they hope that then it would enable the military who do support Chavismo, those who would, for instance, who are called upon to push down the revolts, to push down the opposition, to join the opposition, because therefore they wouldn't be betraying democracy, they wouldn't be a traitor to the state, they would actually be defending it. So that is the point, is that it enables the remaining 32% of the people to establish, to get the support, to basically have an overthrow of the regime.
Michael McCarthy,
and that's
how
the scenario
likely
that's
is
in play.
that? Michael McCarthy, how likely is that? And do you think that the OAS will label Venezuela as undemocratic?
Well, let's start in the first place, and that is the state of the country. I think that Venezuela is a critically weak state with a high potential of becoming a failed state. We saw an illustration of this problem last week in a medium-sized city where there was a massive eruption over food riots, which may have had something to do with internal differences within the Chavista political movement. And basically you have a different part of the country erupting in fire almost every day. This is becoming increasingly commonplace. I think the government is very, very concerned about the situation of political stability in the country. And in that vein, I think it's important to recognize that international stakeholders are simultaneously interested in stability in the country and in promoting democratization. But those two things don't always go together, step in step. So it's going to be very difficult for the international community to coordinate a process or place pressure on both parties for there to be both political stability and political change of a democratic nature in Venezuela this year, I think. It's important to recognize that this week here in Washington, there are in fact dual meetings of the Organization of American States. So for example, today at the OAS there is a session in which 3 heads of state will be at least one former head of state that's part of a delegation of 3 former heads of states will be offering remarks and discussion about efforts to mediate the political crisis between the government and the opposition. The opposition's coalition, the Democratic Unity Table, has rejected these dialogue talks. They published a press release this morning roundly denouncing the idea of a dialogue, or saying that there is no such thing taking place. But nonetheless, this goes to the question that Daniel raised earlier, which is about stalling and buying time. The Maduro government is in a situation of life support, without a doubt, with international oil prices much lower than before and problems with their own oil production, creating very, 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 very steep challenges for them to be able to get out of this very big hole that they themselves have created with very bad policies. They created a sort of oil-dependent economic system. But as I mentioned earlier, I think the question here is, how do we find a balance between political stability, which is what the international community primarily wants, including those here in the hemisphere, including those promoting the Inter-American Democratic Charter, because the crisis in Venezuela is really one primarily of human suffering at this moment, and how to put that in coordination with the question of promoting democracy. It's not going to be very easy.
What about the U.S.'s stance, Michael? The U.S. sort of seemingly taking somewhat of a tougher stance on Venezuela, but also offering to help and rescue the country from the economic crisis it's going through. So a bit of a juggling act over there for the States.
Yeah, I don't think they've offered to sort of save the situation, as your latter point suggested. Just to put things in context, last week in the Dominican Republic, there was a meeting and handshake, an important photo op between the Secretary of State, John Kerry, and Venezuela's Foreign Minister, Delcy Rodriguez. And it's important to realize that, the Obama administration, in particular in its second term, has been very clear about saying that it's willing to sit down with its adversaries when it feels as though it can get something from those talks. First, I think that photo op between Kerry and Rodriguez was about sending a message to the Venezuelans. Look, here in the U.S., we've been able to sit down and talk with the Cubans. The Santos government in Colombia is talking with the FARC, eventually you Venezuelans are going to need to somehow sit down and talk, whether it's before or after a big electoral moment. But what is really at play here in terms of a new round of discussions or talks between the United States government and the government of Venezuela? I think first the United States is interested in diffusing the issue of anti-Americanism. I think its primary interest is to get itself out of the political scuffle between both sides by essentially saying we're open to dialogue with the government. We're not trying to undermine this particular government.
Right.
And then I think there is a very different international moment in the region in which the United States can play a much more prominent role in bringing actors together to form a new consensus around Venezuela. In the past, with Brazil and Argentina, where there were left-wing governments in power, it was much harder for the U.S. to play a sort of role in sort of cajoling and cajoling people together. Now the U.S. can really do that because it's a much different political moment. But it's important to recognize we're in the middle of a general election campaign here in the United States. And there is potentially a very short window for this administration to get something done on Venezuela.
Okay, Daniel, since you're in Caracas, just give us the view for a moment about the situation there. We know that it is very bad. We know that food is becoming increasingly scarce. We know that there are lootings going on and protests right across the country. But how do Venezuelans see the situation over the next 6 to 12 months?
Well, it's 86% of Venezuelans, according to our latest studies, perceive that the situation is very negative, and 62% perceive that it will continue to get worse in the next 12 months. So it's not a hopeful situation at all. And we keep talking about government and opposition, and we do have to remember that Venezuela is a highly polarized society, politically speaking. However, this crisis has shattered political polarization, and it is no longer the opposition part of the population who is unhappy. We see in that 86% there are opposition backers, but there are also former Chavistas or even Chavistas that consider themselves Chavistas but not followers of Mr. Maduro. So that is important to point out because the crisis has definitely gone beyond not only political polarization but also socioeconomic stratification. So it is a crisis that affects absolutely everyone. And as you pointed out, there has been over 254 lootings or looting attempts in the first 5 months of 2016. Over 21 protests, street protests every single day, most of them having to do with non-political issues such as the collapse of services such as water, electricity, and of course food scarcity, which is our first problem. It's not only that people don't have enough money to get by. It is that even if you do have enough money to barely get by, you go out, you run out of the most basic necessities, needs, supplies, food, and you can't get them anywhere. Not even the black market is longer able to supply Venezuelans with the most basic needs. So that has created a society that is in deep political and social turmoil, and that deeply need to weigh a mechanism such as the recall referendum, which is in the
Vanessa, if the
to open up a way for the Venezuelans to express themselves.
So Vanessa, Daniel is talking about how polarized the country is, and it's simply not Nicolás Maduro and his government against the opposition. So, but what does this then mean for any sort of solution going forward?
Look, I'm extremely pessimistic about, a diplomatic solution here. I mean, again, going back to what I was saying about the various scenarios, one is, that the Chavistas may try and hang on. I don't see how they can. I mean, this could, if people continue, if Venezuela is declared undemocratic, you could have a real uprising, kind of an Arab Spring style, violent overthrow coming over the walls of the presidential palace.
Is Venezuela not already having its own version of the Arab Spring, in your opinion?
It might. Increasingly it might. As people become increasingly desperate, that's a scenario that becomes increasingly likely, which is one of the reasons why sticking to the idea of the recall referendum and having it be denied is only a ticking time bomb. For the Chavistas. Another scenario, which is less likely in my view, is that they do come to some sort of accord, and if it is a negotiated solution, you come to some sort of, hybrid government where Chavistas are forced to accept some members of the opposition into the cabinet, which is I suppose possible, alternate world, but highly unlikely. Nobody would want to do that or, be tainted by that. And being sort of you could be part of a so-called transitional government, but you would also then be tainted when you do actually have then open elections if they make it all the way to 2019. I think the violent overthrow is increasingly likely, and I think it'll probably happen before 2016. I just don't before the end of the year.
Michael McCarthy, do you agree with that? Michael McCarthy, do you agree with that? Is this the beginning of the end of Maduro, and what happens going forward?
I thought that the December 6th legislative elections in Venezuela were really the end of the beginning for the Venezuelan opposition. That is to say, it finally got to a point where it was clearly the electoral majority in the country, and it could begin to articulate a positive message for the country. It's stumbled in a couple of places along the way, in particular in the way it started in January, but it's gaining some good momentum right now with the referendum process, which essentially is working to some extent as a safety valve to sort of let pressure off, if you will, a little bit here and there, with some of the processes of signing and coming out to validate your signature. I want to return to a point that Vanessa made. I don't think that any judgment by the Organization of American States regarding the democratic or undemocratic nature of the Maduro government is going to have direct bearing on the street in Venezuela. The Venezuela political situation is an economic problem in terms of the day-to-day problems affecting citizens. It's a situation where people are rioting and looting because of the lack of medicine, because of the lack of food, because they have very poor quality water and energy services. These are the main reasons in which these are the main catalysts of instability in the country. And to go back to Daniel's earlier point about how do we characterize polarization in Venezuela today, I think that it needs to be thought about on two levels, right? You have extreme political polarization at the top, right, between the political elites on both sides, but then you have this broad mass at the bottom, as Daniel indicated, that is really not interested in what the individual agendas of politicians on either side are trying to accomplish, right? It's really more about how do I get to next week, right? This is the short-term political horizon that is affecting the day-to-day life in Venezuela. So in this context, it's very difficult for politicians to really be the articulators of change, right? And it's actually, therefore, difficult to think about a scenario in which leadership is really in control of the situation. And this is the real problem in the country. No, there are no strong leaders really on either side. That has something to do, the government's repression against the opposition is a big factor there. You have an important opposition leader in jail who's been deemed a prisoner of conscience by Amnesty International, Leopoldo Lopez.
Okay.
So, I'm not saying that there aren't important questions out there, but I don't think that Maduro necessarily is going to fall this year because of a violent uprising a la the Arab Spring. I think it's likely to be a collapse from within. So you certainly
disagree with what Vanessa had to say, but let me ask Daniel's point of view on that because he is sitting in Caracas. Do you think that Maduro is going to fall this year, Daniel?
Well, it's very difficult to say for sure. What we do have to point out is that, and to make the point I was referring to earlier, it's no longer an issue of left or right or opposition against the government. It's basically a people who are suffering against a very small group at the top. We're basically being governed by a military oligarchy, and that's an honest way to characterize it. And they're doing, their whole agenda is based on staying in power right now and not resolving Venezuelans' needs. Many ask about a possible transition. Is Venezuela in a democratic transition? And right now, what we have to say is we don't know. We don't know if Venezuela is transitioning towards democracy at a very slow and a very difficult pace, or if Venezuela is on the contrary, transitioning to a deeper, non-democratic system in which military control will be ever more important.
Okay, on that note, I'll have to leave it there. I do apologize. We have run out of time. Thank you to all my guests, Daniel Fermin, Vanessa Neumann, and Michael McCarthy. Thank you for joining us on Inside Story, and thanks for watching the show. You can always see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From myself and the whole team here in Doha, goodbye for now.